Well, good evening. Thank you for sharing your Wednesday evening with us. We have an exciting partnership with Buck Institute and SREB where we are trying to help all of you future AC teachers really start understanding this project-based learning format that we really want to push through AC. We have Tim Kubik on the line. He's going to be presenting, and he has some stuff to say about himself coming up. Very excited to be able to work with him, and he is a font of knowledge, and around 6:45 we're going to address whatever questions you have. However, during the presentation, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat box so that we have a record of it, and we can get to those at the end of the presentation. We'll do our best to get to all the questions, and if we do not get to all of them, Tim's email is on the end of this presentation. He says you can email him with any questions. If there are any questions about AC, you can certainly email me. My name is Zach Riffle, and my email will be sent out. It was sent out with the invitation, but I will send it out again to everyone. That is it. I know you guys want to get started because it is the middle of a Wednesday evening, so I'm going to turn it over to Tim now. Tim?
All right, thank you, Zach. I'm really excited to be here. It's been a couple years that I've been working indirectly with SREB, and I'm glad to see the partnership really formalizing. The webinar we're doing this evening is called The Sliding Scale, Fostering Voice and Choice for Students and Teachers. And it's the first of 3 webinars where we will focus on one of Buck Institute for Education's essential elements of project-based learning. BIE has a great article called The 8 Elements for Project-Based Learning. We're only going to touch on 3 right now because we want to help you think about ways that you can use these 3 elements that we'll cover in the next 3 webinars to make the advanced career projects really work for your students in a way that is sort of custom or tailorized to them. So it's part of this transition to project-based learning. It's not just for students, but it's also for teachers, and that's a really important part of the thrust of the whole 3 webinar series. So tonight we're focusing on voice and choice. Next week we'll be looking at need to know, and then in the final webinar, 2 weeks from now, we'll be looking at in-depth inquiry. A little bit about me, just for background. Zach mentioned there's my email address, tim@bie.org. And if there's a question that you have that doesn't quite get answered during this webinar, I'd be happy to engage with you via email. I've been in education for about 24 years. My first teaching job was actually in the bush of rural West Africa and Liberia until it was cut short by a Civil War experience. But that was where I really discovered project-based learning without knowing what it was. Because it seemed to be the most effective way to teach a classroom with 70 students and no books, nothing really to write on the walls, all that sort of stuff. So we started forming projects and heading out into the community and doing interesting work that kept the students motivated. Came back to the United States after that, took a PhD in history, taught for 11 years at the secondary school level, and then a few years after that at the undergraduate and graduate level. And over the last 6 years, I've been involved with the Buck Institute for Education as a national faculty member, helping schools around the country and within the last year, occasionally around the world, make the transition to project-based learning. 5 years ago, I started working in the career technical field with a school called ACE Leadership School. You can see the website there if you're interested in checking it out. ACE Leadership was a public-private partnership between school leaders in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the Associated General Contractors of New Mexico, who wanted to make sure that students who were thinking about going into architecture, construction, or engineering had a real opportunity to not just learn the trade, but to learn to think about the trade and to think about it like a leader in the industry would. And then 2 years ago, I started to work with teachers in Ohio as part of the Ohio Association of Career Technical Superintendents, who began piloting SREB's health informatics curriculum, which is designed to help students make the transition from largely paper-based management of health records to digital and online management and a lot of database work. So it was a very technically intensive course and a very challenging set of expectations for those new teachers who signed on to do it. And it's been a really productive relationship over the last 2 years. And a lot of the insights that I'll be sharing tonight come from that work with that AC course. So I'm really glad to be here. And we're going to start every webinar with a driving question for us to think about as we go through the webinar. At SREB, you may know this as an essential question, and it's actually very similar, but BI uses a slightly different language. That's not surprising. We're different organizations. And for us, a driving question is something that should motivate students as well as describe the essential content of the question that's going on. So the terminology isn't necessarily all that important as long as that idea of thinking about the students comes through. And you can see here what we hope will happen as we engage this question. For me, as the webinar facilitator, I'm using the question that I'll share with you in a moment to guide planning and think about certain standards, in this case, the essential element of voice and choice. I hope the question that I've crafted will capture and communicate the purpose of our work, and then focus some of the questions that you may have about using voice and choice in a project. And then for you, I hope it will do some of the similar things, but most importantly, reminding you why we're doing this today. Because as Zach said, you are giving up your Wednesday evening to be online here this evening, and we appreciate that. So here's our driving question. How can identifying voice and choice for students professionalize voice and choice for teachers? A key part of my motivation tonight is to help you see that the transition to PBL is not just one that your students need to make, but is also one that you'll be making as well. And that understanding student choices is a key part of our professional responsibility as educators. It's the choices that we make about how we respond to student choices that will really make the advanced career projects meaningful and rich academic experiences for your students. So let's begin with developing an understanding of what Buck Institute education means when we talk about voice and choice. This is an iconic slide in our workshops. The choice between vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry is one that motivates a lot of folks thinking about a dessert. We'll say more about that in a moment. But what I want to stress is that in a project-based learning experience, choosing once does not prevent you from choosing them all, because you may change your mind during the course of the project. So it's important to keep that in mind, that just because a student at one point chooses strawberry doesn't mean the other two choices are off the table. In fact, voice and choice is really a continuum. As this webinar suggests, it's a sliding scale, and that your task as a teacher leading a project-based learning advanced career course is to think about where on that scale you need to be. And we'll spend some more time thinking about that as we go through. So it's not an all or nothing definition. It's not simply choosing once and being done, nor is it simply a choice about what the final product of the project looks like. If you look at this definition from BIE's workbook, you'll see that the stress here is on students making some choices, not just single choices, but not necessarily every choice, and that those choices tend to fall into questions about the direction of inquiry, how they're going to get their work done, how they will use their time, and that the choices that they make need to be developmentally appropriate. Most of you are working with high school students who've made some choices already about the careers that they want to work with. But it's important that we keep in mind that they're not in those careers necessarily, nor are they elementary school students anymore. And so you need to shape their choices based on what your knowledge of them is at that age level, what's developmentally appropriate. So again, directions of inquiry, the types of questions that students ask, the different texts and resources they will choose to use from the wide range of texts that are available in the advanced career courses. The types of products they create, their use of time, their organization of tasks. There are a lot of opportunities for voice and choice in the advanced career projects. What we want to do is encourage you to think about them professionally rather than just turning everything over to the students and saying, here's this giant set of resources, have at it, which is not likely to be tremendously successful. Alternatively, we don't necessarily think that the best thing to do is say, today we're on this page, and turn the page the next day, and turn the page the next day. Part of your professional choice as an educator is going to be about thinking about what your students are doing with the projects and how to respond to that. In a situation like this, it can be helpful to have a rubric. And BIE, Buck Institute for Education, on their website has a project design rubric that we often use to look at and think about different projects. And I'd like to look specifically at the language about voice and choice on that rubric and to help you think about what you should be looking for in terms of those opportunities in the advanced career projects. So we're going to look at two indicators here. These are directly from the rubric. If you're interested in that larger rubric, it is available on BIE's website, which is just bie.org. You see that at the bottom right-hand corner, or SREB.org at the bottom of the left-hand corner of the slides. So if you take a look at these two, what you'll notice is that voice and choice are two very separate words. Students, if we look at the second one first, students have opportunities to take significant responsibility and work independently from the teacher. And the first one goes into a little bit more detail, but also raises this important question of being able to express their voice in the project. So it's not simply a question of making choices, but also an opportunity to express some voice. If we start with that second one, this is what we all want to happen in these projects. It's what they're designed to do, is to get students to take serious responsibility. But if you're like me, who has just in the last month handed keys over to his 16-year-old son for the first time, you know that while this is what we may want to happen, that we want them to take this challenge responsibly, it's not always as easy as it sounds to get students to pick up and do that. A good driving question or essential question can get them started. A good entry event, something we'll talk about later in these webinars, that kicks things off, that can help. But it rarely keeps them going the whole way through, just in the same way that, if I say to my son, drive safely tonight, that'll last for a little while, but it's not going to last forever if he's out for the evening. So we need to think about ways that we keep that, that focus, that voice and choice moving forward, and thinking about the big picture of every project, in terms of where those opportunities for big picture voice and choice are. Where do students have a real voice in the way the project moves forward? And how can they make individual choices along the way that will help them to express that voice? They're not going to choose to take on significant responsibility if they have to follow the exact same steps in the completion of the project, everybody in every team doing everything the same way. That leads to a lot of freedom for students and for teachers, and also some negatives and positives that I just want to be transparent about. Because one of the big parts of the transition to project-based learning is that it often seems, compared to traditional classrooms, very loud and messy. If you visit a traditional classroom, you often see students in rows of desks, working on assignments that are given by their teachers, sometimes responding to teachers' lectures. In a career technical setting, they might be working at different stations, whether it's in an automotive course or whether in a cosmetology course. But the teacher really is in control of the classroom and managing, and a common criticism when people walk into a PBL classroom is that it sounds different. It can be noisy, it can be active, students are doing many, many different things at the same time. And in many ways, it's like an actual workplace that they will go to. Less like what we traditionally think of school, and it requires a different set of project management skills to sort of make sure that the mess doesn't get chaotic, that you don't end up with a lot of different and mixed performance, that you sort of know what your students are up to, and most importantly, that students don't miss opportunities. When voice and choice gets to a point where students are not being productive, you need to nudge them back on task to help avoid these problems. And I say nudge, and this is really important because relying on some traditional classroom management practices, telling students to get back on task or invoking your authority as a teacher may actually undermine some of their interest and enthusiasm in the project. Students are very good at decoding what is a genuine project where they have voice and choice and what is just a very complicated assignment being run by a teacher. And if they decode that it's just an assignment, they tend to lose interest pretty quickly. So nudging with new questions, new information, or new challenges are all effective ways to manage the chaos, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more next week when we engage the question of need to know. But while PBL or project-based learning can be somewhat messy, it also opens up spaces to do things that a traditional classroom might not. And in that way, it's much more flexible. For students, there's often some freedom and some space to explore their own unique interests in a topic rather than doing what everyone else is doing, and also some of their own solutions. Very few of the advanced career projects have a final product imagined exactly the way students are supposed to do it. There are many, many opportunities for them to create unique solutions based on their interaction with you as a teacher, with outside subject matter experts, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the combination of this mess and flexibility actually opens up a lot of spaces for something that business people are saying they really hope our students will be able to do, and that's innovation and passion. Or as someone I was just listening to at the TED Talk conference that I'm working on tomorrow, InnoPassion, this idea that our passions are what drive innovation. That's what 21st century workplaces are going to look like. It's what their employees want, and so that's an important thing that we can add in by adding this flexibility of voice and choice for students. So here you have a sort of summation of some of the things that we get by allowing that flexibility. Generally speaking, student motivation goes up with flexibility as well. So I wanted to shift to some things that you may have heard about project-based learning and address them. A lot of people have probably heard this comment that, traditional classroom is the sage on the stage, not entirely unlike this webinar where someone is speaking at great length and an audience is listening. You may have heard that project-based learning is more about being the guide on the side. And it's an interesting contrast, but in many of your fields, and as a shop teacher once said to me, if I stand on the side, the kids are going to lose their fingers, right? I got to be more directly involved, and there's a point there. Project-based learning does not mean that the teacher is out of the equation. There are some interesting experiments around the country in totally student-directed project-based learning, but at Buck Institute for Education and in the advanced career courses, there's still a strong place for the teacher as a professional educator making choices about what it is that the students need in order to achieve their objectives and outcomes. Which leads to another phrase that's often associated with PBL, and that's the notion of the mentor in the center. Again, it's a popular comparison, and I think it's a little bit better for two reasons. One, it really acknowledges that the teacher is still at the center of the student learning experience. We're sending students to school to work with teachers because teachers have something to offer, regardless of the methodology used. So you can't really just sort of sit on the side and watch the learning happen. You play an active role as a professional educator making judgments about what students need at different times. But it is a different role, and mentorship, I think, is something that most of us understand not from our classroom experiences, but more likely from learning to do something in our families. If you think about who taught you to fish, almost certainly it was probably your grandfather. And he didn't sit you down with a bunch of books and lectures and tell you how to fish. He took you out fishing, and you learned to love fishing with him. The same could be true if you learned how to bake cookies. You probably learned from your mom or your grandmother, and you might have had a cookbook, but really you paid attention to thinking about what they were doing in the kitchen. And mentorship is really a lot more about that kind of relationship, and it's a relationship that allows you to make some instructional shifts. The real shift in project-based learning that opens up voice and choice is realizing that you as a teacher have some choices to make as well. If students drift too far down their own path of inquiry so that they're not really working on the project but doing something entirely different, then you might need to shift your weight back towards the original standards and documents and outcomes that were projected in the advanced career course. Because obviously, if they're working in health informatics or energy resources courses, they need to be demonstrating for their career choices that they're, mastering some of those skills. Conversely, if they've gone too much and are just sort of doing the assignment and they're not being very creative or innovative, then you might need to shift your weight back more toward their voice and choice. So really what you see going on here is a series of instructional shifts where ultimately the catchy slogans don't capture what needs to happen because the instructional shift is not one or the other, but is you exercising choices about how you will try to quote-unquote control your classroom. And it's a balancing act, and for a lot of teachers it can be a difficult balancing act to maintain. It's not a single position, but a willingness to change positions in order to suit the needs of the learners in your project that are going to make the project succeed. With that said, if you stop and think about that for a moment, here's our deep thought for the webinar, you probably will never teach the same exact advanced career course twice because different students, different directions, different choices that they make will require you to make different responses. And that's, I think, actually one of the really exciting things about project-based learning is that you as a teacher get to go through the learning experience as well, not just the students. So to get back to thinking about you as a teacher, in order to live on this sliding scale, you really need a sense of balance, how you're going to find your own voice, make your own choices on a day-to-day basis. Yes, you've got to know the advanced career course curriculum that you'll be teaching, And you have to have a sense of what students should be doing each day, but you also have to have a willingness to let them surprise you a little bit. And you have to think about whether what they need is every single lesson that's specified in the curriculum or every single day's activities, or do you need to conduct some workshops on the annotated bibliographies because students are struggling with that concept, and maybe another team doesn't need that because they seem to get it. Do you have to conduct just-in-time lessons for the entire class around a mathematical principle because after struggling with it for a while, nobody gets it? Those are the kinds of questions that you need to think about, and the next 15 or 20 minutes of the webinar, we want to look at some concrete examples about choices that you can make as you go through the advanced career projects. And I do want to encourage you, if you have any questions as we go through this, to type them during the webinar so that we can come back and see them toward the end of this. The first idea is, and this is a BIE concept, Buck Institute concept, is the choice between running the projects as a main course activity where the learning occurs while they're working on the projects, or a dessert activity. And we really want to encourage you to make the choice for the former rather than the latter. Many of you may have remembered doing projects in elementary school or middle school where the teachers would teach you for a while, and then they would say in the final week of the unit, now you get to work on this project. But the project was really kind of a dessert for once you've done the learning, and most teachers use those projects as a way of doing project-based assessment rather than project-based learning. We think when the students are struggling with interesting questions all the way through and doing the learning during the project, they're going to be a lot more engaged than if they have to sit and listen for 3 weeks of teaching, and then you say, now it's time to work on the project. The bright students in the class will have figured out everything they can by paying attention to your teaching lessons, and the students who are struggling probably checked out because they got lost in the second or first week, and they're not going to be very motivated to take on the challenge of the project if they didn't really understand things from the lessons. So letting people do work during the project, doing a main course project, is an important choice. And that's sort of thinking about it at the unit level. But another way to think about it on a day-to-day level is, do you front load everything at the start of every day? Do you have them come in and tell them what they're going to do and then let them do it and then tell them that they did it? Or do you give them a very brief introduction to what they need and then let them mess around with it and see what they do? Really doing more backfilling rather than front loading. This is a tough skill to learn because it's hard to know, how successful can students be with a difficult mathematical equation unless I give them a lot of stuff up front. But the more you can try to focus on a very brief mini lesson, 5 to 10 minutes at most, and see what they do with it, the more you can play that balancing act of saying, oh, I guess they didn't do much with it. They'll come to you for questions because they'll start having questions. And if you teach them everything they know at first, they may wonder why it is they need to work on stuff. So think of it as just-in-time teaching. Give them a little bit to get started, backfill as they need it as individuals or small teams. And as another visual image to help you out here, hopefully, it is a sliding scale, and you might find yourself on any given day doing a little bit of both. You may be front-loading with one team or one group of students in a small session and maybe backfilling toward the end of the class period with another group that really was able to work independently on their own. So that's the sliding scale again. A fourth thing that you need to, or third thing you need to think about is the difference between having a plan. The advanced career projects give you a ton of information to work with, but you may not necessarily need to deliver every single lesson for every single student based on their success in tinkering around with the ideas. And it may be just having a design. This is a tool that we use at BIE to take a look at a project and say, well, if the final product is this, what skills and competencies and content do students need to know, and what activities are essential to demonstrating that they know it. And in this example, we go here for a second, what you see is a breakdown of a project that required students to make blueprints and budgets for a house for families who lost their home in a tornado outside of Oklahoma City a few years ago. A lot going on in here, but basically this is a way of taking a very complicated project and saying as a teacher, look, this is the stuff, this is really the heart of the project. Students who can't do this can't be successful at all, and I need to make sure that all students are able to do this. So that's trying to understand the design of the advanced career courses, not just sort of going through day by day, but looking at the big picture and thinking, what was the design intention here? And if students are making this product, or working to solve this problem, what really do they have to know in order to be successful? Again, this comes down to some of your choices as a professional educator, but what we want to stress here is it's not the way you would do the project, right? But as you look at thinking about what things are essential for students and being willing to adjust it, if in fact it turns out that most of your students already are very good at doing budgets and cost analysis, and so that part may not be essential, there may be something else in the project that is essential. Another point to raise as you look at the wealth of resources that are available in the advanced career courses is to be ready with some advanced challenges. They're in the curriculum, and you want to make sure that you are aware of them so that when a team of students comes to you the second week of a 3 or 4 week project and says, we think we're done, that you can pose questions to them that force them to go back and rethink their project and go at a deeper level. There are a variety of resources out there for good probing questions. If you're interested in those, I can certainly share those during Q&A toward the end. But there are plenty of resources in the advanced career courses that can help you think about that as well, and you want to be ready for that when necessary. Likewise, you should look at the advanced career courses and think about the ways in which you can use some of the activities to scaffold the content and competencies that students may need help with or even remediation with. Some of the courses produce very real-world challenges that are going to be significant challenges for students, and you want to make sure that you've thought about what specific activities in the courses might be useful to help students make constructive choices rather than start to feel defeated because they don't understand the concepts. So that leaves the final choice to consider is what's your role as a teacher in these projects. It sounds like a lot. And for teachers who are new to project-based learning, the first year is very, very challenging, and it's usually not into the middle of the second year that things really start to feel comfortable. So what I want to tell you is that you really shouldn't approach these projects alone. Most of the advanced career courses have a role for outside subject matter experts, or SMEs for short, and they can do a lot of work helping you to help the students think about the work more critically. And in some of the examples we'll look at here in a moment, you'll see that. Subject matter experts are also very, very powerful in helping to raise the standards above the standards that may exist for, English or a technical field. Because subject matter experts are up to date and in the know about the way this field is practiced right now today. And that's something that can often be very, very hard to stay on top of as a classroom teacher in that field. Many of you have great experience working in your career fields, but it may be even just 2 or 3 years old, and it wasn't 2 or 3 years ago that not a whole lot of people were doing webinars, for example. So there's been a big change in a lot of our professions, and outside subject matter experts can help students to really understand that. They can also help in this very important question, which is how we know the students. You obviously gather a lot of information about students on a day-to-day basis from class, but people from outside who are working with the project will also help you give some insight into what's going on with your students, whether their project is succeeding, whether their project is struggling. It's very important that you base your decisions about how you work with the advanced career courses as a professional on what it is the students seem to need. We want to encourage you to make some interesting choices about how to reach your students with these courses, but those professional choices are less about what you teach and the way you teach it, and more about how and when you teach to meet the needs of your students. And you will have all 4 of these different types of students in your classroom, and teams of students with similar different needs. And we want to help you think about how to respond to those different needs using the resources in the curriculum. So we're about halfway through our time, and I wanted to just sort of wrap up by looking at 2 very specific case studies from advanced career courses so that you can get a sense that, yeah, these are good ideas, hopefully, but also, so what does it really look like and feel like in advanced career courses? So we're going to look at the sliding scale in a couple of examples, starting with what backfilling the content might really look like. We talk a lot about making the shift from covering to uncovering the learning. And if you let students uncover the material, you can see some of the options that come up. They'll find out things that you would have planned to teach anyway. Subject matter experts will add some of those things so that you don't need to teach them. And then you can also work with subject matter experts to help students figure out what's missing. So if we look at the South Carolina Renewable Energy curriculum, for example, It exposes students to the need for direct instruction and the need for student discovery. Students will attempt some crude experiments with renewable energy concepts before applying mathematics to compare actual and theoretical results related to flow rate. This will eventually involve learning the Bernoulli principle, and none of us really believes that students are likely to discover the Bernoulli principle on their own. But they're likely to get close enough that when you reveal the Bernoulli principle to them in a lesson, they'll get it a lot more deeply than if you just taught it to them for the first time without any real thinking about how to understand flow rate with water moving out of a hole. So your lesson on the Bernoulli principle ends up becoming a valuable thing that students need because they've gotten to a point where they have to acknowledge out of their own work that they don't quite understand how to do these calculations, and they'll want the answer. So that's one example that we can look at of backfilling the content. And if we dig a little bit deeper on that, if we dig a little bit deeper, what you'll see is that within the curriculum itself on day 3 of that particular course on renewable energy, you have some very well-structured information for you in thinking about the way that you do this. The directions for that day include asking the instructor to introduce the scenario briefly, present the context for the mathematics in the project, but not to hand out the actual formulas to the students yet, but instead allow them to do some preliminary tests where they're cutting holes into a bottle, measuring the size of the hole, trying to determine the flow rate, using the area of the hole to determine the velocity of the water, etc. And then giving them the Bernoulli principle as the answer that they really need to try to understand that flow rate. So the projects have been designed with this kind of backfill concept in mind, and we just want to make sure that you're looking out for those opportunities in the advanced career projects. This example also helps us really understand about what happens to direct instruction. A lot of people think that when you shift to PBL, you never do any lecturing again, and that's not entirely true. Because when you realize that whole groups need some teaching, that's what you can do, is teach a concept that they need. You can backfill parts of a concept with some direct instruction if teachers or if students are missing something. And you can use a lesson that you might have taught through direct instruction as a way of checking for understanding when individuals are all missing the same point, right? You can sort of go over things and say, does this help us all now understand what it is we need to do? So backfill is really an important shift to make. And it's important to remember that you will end up teaching most of the project. Students will come to you with questions, however, rather than you front-loading everything and saying, now go work on this. And that makes you a much more valuable resource. The subject matter experts can also play a key role in that as well, because you can sort of say, well, this is what I would think, but have you asked 2 or 3 subject matter experts for their opinion, and then let's talk about what we learned by comparing all 3 of our opinions. And on the subject of subject matter experts, the advanced career curriculum does have a lot of places in the courses that specify the kinds of experts you want to look for. It can't necessarily tell you exactly where to find them in your community, but it can tell you the types of businesses or the types of organizations you would want to look to. And subject matter experts do a lot of exposing of concepts to students without you having to do the teaching. As we mentioned before, they really can raise the standards, especially if you involve the subject matter experts early in the process and don't just save them to judge student work at the end. They help students move beyond just understanding the concepts of the courses to actual application. And importantly, and this is what we'll wrap up with, is they help us think about these 4 competencies: collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creativity. So in a project coming out of Kentucky with integrated production technology, the neat thing about the way that subject matter experts are used in this course is that students go on a field trip to learn about lockout tagout systems that take care of the maintenance of machines in a manufacturing setting. But it doesn't just stop with the field trip. They're expected to make connections with a subject matter expert on that field trip that they can use as a resource throughout the course of the project. They can ask workers and safety managers about how those systems are implemented. They can try to determine what might be meaningful improvements. They can try to offer those improvements to the subject matter experts and say, hey, did you all ever think about this? So it takes a lot off your plate because it puts the students in authentic conversations out in the community with people who can really support their learning. And you become sort of the third leg of the stool that helps that learning if the subject matter experts run into times with students where they don't quite understand as teachers how to help a student learn something that they may have shared with them. So that concept of the third leg of the stool is really important. It does take a lot of work off your plate. So I want to dive into two very specific examples to wrap things up, and then we'll take some questions. We're going to dig a little bit more deeply and to see how you and subject matter experts can use two 21st century competencies to increase student voice and choice. So I want to start by looking at collaboration. One of the 4 C's, and here's a quote. It comes from, Buck Institute has a new book out on using 21st century competencies in public education, and this is a quote that was brought in that book. The important point here is to stress the concept of application. As human beings are listening, interacting, which I hope we'll get to do here in just a moment in the last 15 minutes or so, the quality of the work is going to go up when that collaboration occurs. I know a lot of people are nervous about group work. I always call it teamwork as a way of avoiding that word. And if you focus on what collaboration really should be in a project, working in pairs or small groups to complete tasks, working with others to set goals, creating joint products with different individual contributions. So all of us had an individual thing that we worked on and that came together to make the whole. But not just because each of us did a part, but because we thought different things and made different contributions about the whole project. In addition to that, presenting their teamwork to an audience, not just letting one person be the face and speaking, but all of them working on it equally, working as a team to incorporate feedback, and then giving feedback to members of their peers. I often say in my own workshops that our coaches in our buildings, our athletics coaches, are really the people who understand this kind of collaboration best because they rely on all 6 of these points to really help students on their teams think about how to win the big game on Friday night or Wednesday. Basketball is over for now, but there are a lot of games that don't happen on Friday night too. Maybe there's a softball game going on this evening. So collaboration can really foster voice and choice if we focus on 4 of these collaboration concepts. Where students have an opportunity to work with others to set goals, they not only have choices, they have a real voice in what they're doing. Their goals for how they want to accomplish a project become their goals, not the goals that were written in the course. Their choice about how they're going to bring individual contributions together is another way of recognizing voice. And certainly dealing with feedback, whether it's within their team or team-to-team feedback, is a way for them to, 1, hear each other's voice about what they think about each other's work, and then 2, make choices about which of those things they want to incorporate. So using collaboration as an opportunity to increase choice, not just to get the job done, but to really do the job better, is an important skill. And if we look at a specific SREB Advanced Career course here, the Innovations in Science and Technology course, you can see that in action. And I just want to walk us through that briefly so that we can see that. For those of you not familiar with this Science and Technology course, students are tasked as engineers to work with the Peace Corps in thinking about ways to develop cheap and easily assembled devices to harness ocean wave energy in order to provide electricity to schools on the coast of Senegal. Very authentic, interesting real-world project with a global connection. The essential question there is, how can the energy found in the ocean waves be captured and used to generate electricity? So students are going to be doing a bunch of different research about waves and wave generators within their groups and starting to plot some solutions as individuals that they then bring together as a team and sort of say, well, I've got this idea. I think this is what needs to happen. And other members of the team will come up with different ideas. And then they're going to have to collaborate to compromise and figure out what the best method is that they want to propose to the, hypothetically, to the Peace Corps in order to capture the energy from waves. So there are a lot of opportunities here for voice and choice and multiple opportunities for you to practice balancing student choice with the standards and objectives of the course. I do a lot of work in California. I can imagine a bunch of kids suddenly thinking, we get to think about waves and immediately want to turn this into trying to make surfboards capture wave energy. And that would be a place where I'd want to say, well, actually, that's not probably going to make much of a generator, right? We need to steer back to what this actual challenge is rather than figure out ways that we can use surfing for credit. Alternatively, you may have students who take very, very traditional approaches to this and just sort of say, well, put some paddles in the water and it'll be a generator and I'm done, right? And you'll want to push them to be a little bit more creative and look for that sweet spot in the project. So you'll need to be paying close attention to what students are communicating about the project, not just the way they're working together. And that gets us into spaces where that communication can lead to a really important part of where voice and choice comes up. Communication is not just when students are talking, which it certainly is, but as you can see here in this quote, again from the new BIE book, communication needs to be two-sided and vital in order to make it real for students. And that's not just the communication between them and you as the teacher about the work that they're doing so that you can assign a grade to it, although it certainly involves that. But it's also the way that students are conveying ideas in things other than paper. Are they using some sort of project management system in school like Edmodo or Schoology or Project Foundry or Moodle or one of those kinds of tools to communicate back and forth in a way that you can sort of drop in on their chat rooms and sort of see what they're talking about? When and how are they preparing and delivering oral presentations? Again, not just at the end, but also, how are they going to talk to those subject matter experts the first time? What will they say to them? What kind of questions will they ask? How do they answer questions when a subject matter expert asks them a question? And then deciding how they're going to present that information in a way that really demonstrates their learning is an opportunity for voice and choice, as is, and this is very important in a lot of the technical fields, being able to communicate in something other than words, not just using written work or spoken work, but actually having powerful graphs, tables that really give truth to that statement that sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So again, communication can be a great source for voice and choice if we focus particularly on the way that students are answering questions with their audience and deciding how to present their work in a way that demonstrates their learning. And you'll again be thinking about how you want to balance those two things. If we look specifically at the way that a course has done this in the advanced career courses, let's look at West Virginia's Energy and Power course. This is the first course in that series, and it's the 4th project. Again, students are given a challenge from their boss to design a heat exchanger that can produce a 10 to 20 degree temperature drop in the service water that is used in a business. They're given a range of variables for what the temperatures need to be. And what they're asked to do is find a mentor in the field with the help and direction of the teacher with whom they can discuss the developments of their projects during various stages of the discovery. This mentoring leads to potential improvement in the end in the product itself, but also in the way that the students think about and design the project during the course of the project, and possibly also some opportunities for them to think about different applications of the project, not just the one that the challenge is set for them. So the mentor is giving the students all sorts of frequent and formative voice and choice that you as a teacher need to make sure you're finding some way to capture and collaborate. So possibly just communicating with those mentors once a week and sort of finding out what students are talking about, or inviting mentors with school approval and background checks and all that sort of stuff considered into chat spaces where students are planning and thinking so that you have visible record of those voice and choice opportunities that students are making as they're communicating with one another and with their outside experts and with yourself. So in the end, you end up with a very balanced set of different kinds of assessments coming through. And you see down at the bottom of that balance, 21st century competencies are a part of that equation. Later in the webinars, we'll talk a little bit more about some of these others, formative assessments, process, self and peer, etc. But it all balances out the very important tests that students will need to take at the end of a unit, in many cases, in order to get career technical certifications. They have to be able to pass certain professional standards tests. But in order to do well on those final traditional assessments, these other forms of assessment on the left-hand side that are really part of critical thinking, of communication, of collaboration during the course of the projects are things that you can capture to help students really be ready and to raise the standards beyond the standards that are covered in the project. The more students are uncovering stuff on their own, the more likely they are to remember it for the test, and the more likely it is that they will perform better than might traditionally be the case. One final point that I want to stress, and I may be dating myself with this music reference, but if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. You have the freedom and the choice to balance what goes on in the AC projects, but there may be some days where it's just fine to choose to just let the students keep working the way they are. This doesn't mean that you need to be active every single moment of time. You need to choose to respond when students seem to need that response, and if a project is going along really well, then you might as well just let it go along smoothly and know that that is a very powerful professional choice to make as well. So as we wrap up and you start thinking about your advanced career course, what I'd like to ask you to do is you read through that course, think about where you can emphasize the 21st century competencies that we talked about tonight to increase voice and choice for students. Zach and Brooke and myself, my two colleagues from SREB, we've gone through some courses to find examples to help you get thinking in those ways, and we'd encourage you to do the same thing. Not just to look through the course day by day and sort of think about what you'll be teaching, but to look through the course day by day and think about what choices do I have here. And to do that a little bit in advance rather than just the night before you do the class, so that you do have a sense of the big picture. And as you're thinking about that big picture, we'd like to leave you again with our driving question from this webinar as an opportunity for reflection until we come together next week. And that question again is, how can identifying voice and choice for students professionalize voice and choice for me as a teacher? That is a question that we'll revisit at the start of next week's webinar. But at this point, if there are any questions that people would like to ask me directly about what we've discussed, I'm happy to either jump back through the slides and take a look at a particular slide and talk about that, or entertain any questions you may have. But I do thank you for spending the last 45 minutes listening to me, and would love it if we have some questions that we can field at this point.
While people are getting their thoughts together, Tim, let me take another opportunity to say thank you for doing this for us. I'm sure it was insightful, or excuse me, enlightening for everyone, as it certainly was for me. And does anyone have any questions, either specifically about AC or about the voice and choice that Tim has been explaining to us? Well, Tim, it looks like you might have knocked this one out of the park.
Well, thanks, Zach. I do want to encourage people, if you would like to address an individual question to me, that you are welcome to do so at tim@bie.org. That would include, as you're going through the career course that you're going to be teaching, and if you're wondering whether this is one of those voice and choice opportunities I was talking about, I'd be glad to hear about it and give you my thoughts and feedback. I do want to stress that you really have an immense resource, a very valuable resource in front of you in your AC courses, but there will be a big difference if you approach it this way with thinking about voice and choice than if you approach it by just sort of turning the page after page and taking students through the projects. You'll find that the student motivation goes up significantly if you've thought about opportunities for voice and choice. So look forward to seeing everybody online next week again, where we'll be talking about how to use a very problematic phrase, need to know, making the shift from thinking about need to know as what students need to know in order to succeed in the project to why they need to know this, why they want to know these things. And that's another opportunity for where you can increase motivation and voice and choice for your students as you think about need to know. So look forward to tuning in with you again next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And thanks very much, Zach and Brooke, for the opportunity to do the webinar this evening.